we're not terribly interested, well, we are interested in his whole political, his military career, his oratory skills, etc. But we really found this incredibly famous man and wanted to know a bit more about him as a man rather than all these wonderful things that he did in his rather short life. And particularly what he was doing in our part of the woods, Van Diemen's Land, and finding this hut site, which was never lost really, but it allowed us to come at it at a completely different angle. The site was reported to me by a Forest Practices Officer, Peter Norton, who was then at Guns, and said, you know, look, we've got this coup going to happen, I really want you to come up and advise us on what we should do about Meagher. Well, I knew very little about Meagher at that stage, to be honest. This is about 6 years ago. But with Peter's help and the help of a lot of people, we now know quite a bit more about him. And that's Peter from Guns at the site the first time he took me there. I think it's really important that people understand that every forest practices plan requires an investigation of the heritage. It doesn't just come about randomly. I don't wander around the countryside. There's a team of forest practice officers out there whom I work with to get the best outcome for heritage.
So, who was Thomas Francis Meagher? He was born into a wealthy merchant family in Waterford, Ireland in 1823. He received a Catholic education with the Jesuits at Clongowes Wood College and later at Stonyhurst College in England. Quite an impressive building and quite an impressive background. In 1843 he returned to Ireland intending to read law. He became involved in the Repeal Association of the Act of Union 1800 and became one of the leaders of the Young Islander movement. Meagher's oratory skills were outstanding and he became famous for his sword speech delivered in 1846, in which he stated that direct action would be required to gain freedom for Ireland. Something that you may not know is that he designed the Irish flag. In 1848 he presented his design for an Irish flag to the Irish people. Did you know that, Sean? Well, it was worth coming. He helped arrange, but was not at, the ill-fated Battle of Ballingarry, where the unprepared Young Islanders were beaten by the more organised British troops. The leaders went into hiding and Meagher was arrested a few days later for high treason. And that's just a shot of the trial, of his trial for high treason. Following that, he was sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land, and on board the Swift, which is the convict transport that he came on, he announced that he would henceforth be known as Omar rather than Meagher. When they arrived in Van Diemen's Land in October 1849, the Irish prisoners were granted a ticket of leave, which placed a restriction on their movements but gave them a certain degree of freedom. The conditions that he had imposed on him were that he would not escape, that he would live in his allocated district, his police district, and that he would not meet with the other Irish political prisoners. Maybe 2 out of 3 he ignored, yeah? Not sure about number 2. Okay. He rented a cottage in the small township of Ross, which was in the Campbelltown Police District. Now, after about a fortnight in the police district, he was feeling a little bit restless and constrained. And he said, I came to the conclusion that between a prison and a district, there was just about the same difference as exists between a stable and a paddock. In the one you are tied up by a halter. In the other, you have the swing of the tether. In his police district, he associated with wealthy Midlands landowner George Carr Clark, who gave Omar the land up at Lake Sorrel. The state prisoners are situated in different districts, and our Mr. Meagher is at Ross. He is a very gentlemanly young man and was educated for the bar. He is a constant visitor at Ellenthorpe, which was Carr Clark's property. They spend their time hunting, shooting, riding, etc., and 4 of these, Mitchell, Martin, O'Doherty and Omar, have subscribed towards a boat, now at my station at Dog's Head, Lake Sorrel, where they spend a great portion of their time on the water. A great deal more freedom than the majority of Irish convicts, or convicts generally. He had no time for his compatriots, for the Irish convicts that were here. He said, "I will never settle in this country, never. It is a beautiful, glorious island, that is, so far as heaven has blessed it. The population, with the exception of a few free settlers, are as disgusting a race as ever breathed. But lonely as it is, I would not leave it for the gayest and most companionable house in the colony. For here I am shut out from the community I so despise and hate, and see nothing and hear very little of the scandal and the scoundrelism which abounds below in the townships and wherever 2 or more of those infernal convicts are grouped together." Now you remember I said he wasn't supposed to meet with the other young islanders. They stayed within their districts, but this was the place where they could meet, at Tunbridge on the bridge. So they weren't actually breaching that rule.
In this phase of the paper, we're really moving into focus on the cottage, which you've already seen a slide of, but just to remind us, up there, right on the shores of Lake Sorrel, beautiful countryside. Why is he there? Well, we think he's particularly making an escape. He's escaping from the confines, although as Dianne points out, they're rather large confines. And nevertheless, he finds them very confining. He doesn't like the people, he doesn't associate with his colleagues, and in 1850, on George Carr Clark's land, there's Ellenthorpe on the map, and you can see Mars Bay at Lake Sorrel there, just below Dog's Head. He decides to build a house. Now Mars, very fortunate because Daddy is extremely wealthy, right? So unlike a lot of the other exiles, the political exiles, he's got a lot of money to spend. And Daddy's fairly free with writing him, however they got money over from Waterford to Hobart in those days. So he actually gets this, he says he built his hut. Well, I dare say Ma didn't have a lot to do with the labouring side of it. He had the hut built by labourers, and we're very fortunate because this doesn't happen often in archaeology, that we do have Mitchell's sketch of the hut, which gives us some idea of what it looked like. The jetty, the Esperanza actually could seat about 8 people, so his sort of perspective isn't all that brilliant there, but it gives you an idea of Ma and what he thought he needed to build in his escape. So the next little bit focuses on the hut and what they've revealed. We're going to use a landscape approach. Archaeologists in particular are very fond of this, not just concentrating on one site, but how did it interrelate with other aspects of the landscape, the towns, the other people, the cities, or the environment in which they're there. And so that's where we're coming from. We're using a landscape approach. And using that approach, we have to think, well, what's he doing? What's he constructing at his lake? We know he's constructed the cottage. He's got stables. He's got servants, quarters, a jetty and a boat. He's creating a little demesne up there of his own, putting his stamp on the landscape. We've done a survey of it. The surveyor's here today, Lloyd Griffith. We also hiked through that bush that Bob was talking about, except we had all the surveying equipment to carry as well. And we've got a pretty good idea of what the site looked like. The cottage is interesting because we're talking 1851. It's Irish Georgian in style. So whereas most of the Georgian cottages we're looking at in Tasmania would end here with the 2 chimneys, this is very Irish of that period. We've got the 3 windows at the front and the offset door. And he's actually used that model on the construction, and I found all where the doorways were from the remains, and probably the windows, although they're a bit harder to discriminate on what's left there today. But I'm fairly certain that it was an Irish style. He's making a statement there, isn't he? Yeah, I don't think you get that many huts up at Lake Sorrel in 1851. So it tells us something about the man as well. The site complex up there, we've got the cottage, the lake. We can't find anything at the jetty, but the stones have been turned over so many times. The stable site appears to be up here. And one thing we've got to remember about Meagher is that he loved his horses. And if he could get a real thoroughbred, and he did, he would have stabled them probably nearly as well as the servants' quarters, etc., which appear to be these two cottages over here. So he's building quite a complex. The boat we've talked about. I just would like to add a quote out of one of his papers. Would that I was happy, for willingly I would wish goodbye to everything I have here, boat and all, to be free once more, under the protection of a flag I could love and serve. And that clearly wasn't the Union Jack at that stage.
And the name of the boat is the Spanish word for hope.
He had a gardener over there on St George's Island across Lake Sorrel. He had a gardener over there, and his job was to create a garden. We think they put it over there on the island. It is not quite an island, but not clearly enough. You could eradicate your wallabies and other possums, etc., and start to grow things. And the land around Meagher's hut is extremely bony. So he's got this gardener over here that he goes and plants radishes and cabbages and various other food. So he's making a real sort of place for himself to live, a little shire of his own. But he hasn't got a woman until he meets Catherine. So our Catherine, I don't think we've got enough time to go into great depth, but he married Catherine, who was a governess to the doctor in Ross. And they met when the doctor's carriage got a broken wheel, and Meagher, being, of course, the gentleman he was, stopped and helped them repair the wheel. And he's courting Catherine from pretty much that time on. She's 18 at this stage. He makes a lot of enemies from his fellow exiles, the other young islanders, because to marry Catherine, he had to apply for a permit to the governor. And they're not very amused by this because they want to stand back and be different. But Meagher went ahead and did it anyway. Catherine was native born, but her father was a convict, and she grew up in New Norfolk. And when they married, he moved her up to the cottage, which is now finished. She gave birth to their first son, Henry, who was unfortunately born a month after he left, but we'll come to that later. Henry died in Richmond, and that's his headstone at the Catholic Church in Richmond, if you ever want to go and have a look at it. He populated his landscape not just with the wife, but with the servants. Tom Egan, who was a ribbon man, a political prisoner, if you'd like in our terminology today, from Ireland. He had Jack, the old sailor, to run the Speranza. He had the gardener, who I can't find any names for. He had Brian the wolfhound. I think this is lovely. Here's Brian. Now, I'm not sure where this picture comes from, because it's obviously Martin's original one, but with the wolfhound drawn into it. So where this one comes from, it's in the museum in Launceston.
Bishop actually did both drawings.
Did he?
Yes, one with the dog and one layout.
So this one's in... I'll talk to you later. And, of course, his beloved horses. He populated his landscape with visitors. We talked to you about the bridge earlier. They said that Meagher's hut was built on the boundary of 3 of the police districts. And they weren't too bad off before they had GPS. Here's the hut site, and, well, not quite right, but they believed it. And there's a story that when they sat in each of the corners of Meagher's living room, they hadn't broken their parole because they were still in their own districts. So that was very important to them. But we know today they were just a tad out, but doesn't matter. Meagher escapes. In 1852, in a very well-planned operation, which I don't have time to describe to you, but it's a fascinating story in itself, he rides off to Launceston. Now, we've got to remember Ma's horses are a lot better than the Coppers. The Coppers had the old nags, right? And he's got the race horses or the thoroughbreds, so he waves goodbye and takes off through the bush. And Mr. Plod hasn't got a chance of catching up with him. He goes to Launceston from there on a boat out to the Bass Strait Islands over Flinders Group, where he's picked up by an American whaler. It's all arranged, and goes via Brazil and comes to New York to a very large welcome. New York and Boston, of course, were full of Irish people at that time. Because he had to hand in his ticket of leave or he would break his parole, and breaking your parole wasn't something he could dream of doing, he rode down to Ross and said, here's my ticket of leave, and handed it in. And I think it took nearly a day for the Coppers to wake up that he might be going to escape. So they waited until the police got nearby. He was alerted. There were people all the way along the track saying, they're coming, they're coming. He waved goodbye and off he went. We think the cottage is largely abandoned at that point. I'm sure there were other people lived in there from time to time. But all of the artefacts that I see on the ground, the type of window glass that's there, the broken bits of pottery, are all 1850s stuff. There's nothing more modern that, you'd say was late 19th century. So it seems like the cottage was largely abandoned from the point of his escape. Now, that's the sort of story. And what do we make of it? We're working on three themes at the moment. The whole idea of Ma creating a new identity for himself. Ireland is draining people at this stage. It's bleeding people leaving Ireland to go all around the world, particularly America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They're just bleeding people. And he's part of them, but unlike a lot of those people that they bled, they chose to go. He was sent. And there's a whole literature, which again I can't go into, about how you create a new identity when you migrate, or in his case, forced migration. And again, I think we're looking into that theme and seeing how Ma fits into that theme. The political romanticism movement is rampant at this stage. We've got people saying, all through Europe, Hungary, Poland, France, Ireland, saying, our traditions are more important than these big governments. Our Irish poets, our Irish ceremonies, or our Polish ceremonies. And there's a whole political romance movement going on, of which Ma and indeed I think all the young Islanders are particularly part of. He demonstrates, we'll come back to that, and we're going to look at how Ma's role fits in with that political romanticism movement. And importantly, I think he's affirming all the time his membership of a certain class, and that is the gentleman class. He can't escape his background, none of us can really. So if we look at the new identity he's creating for himself, the first thing he does is change his name. I'm from Ma. I'm from Ma. So he's saying, I'm Irish, I'm from Ireland. You can't take that away from me. And this is the day he hops on the convict ship to bring him to leave Ireland. I think he's stamping his identity on that environment at Lake Sorrel, using all those Irish icons that I identified before, the house style, the dog, and etc., etc. He's creating his own place within what must have been an incredibly alien life environment for him. He's an urban boy. He's well educated. He's been to boys' schools all his life. And suddenly there he is at 24 up at Lake Sorrel, not even supposed to go and talk to his friends. So he's creating his identity in a new environment. And the boat name, of course, fits into that. This political romanticism relies heavily on the contrast between natural environment and built environment. So the natural environment, Wordsworth. Give me a line from Wordsworth, Dianne. That sort of thing, it's the whole environment is lovely and good and everything that we'd want in life, whereas the melee of the towns is the opposite. You don't want it. And we find in the literature that Ma often uses Wordsworth's quotes in his letters to people or in what he writes. The wonderland of the lake and serenity and all those sorts of terms he uses. So he hated, we said earlier, he hated the melee of the towns. Well, so he's distanced himself, he's put himself into the wilderness or the naturalness, away from that. It's often an expression of personal response to political defeat, and he was defeated. I don't think he was disillusioned, but he was certainly defeated. And this is where we're trying a very long bow at this stage, is what gives the appeal about Catherine, this 18-year-old girl, very innocent, very unlike any women he would have mixed with in his life in Ireland, or probably absence of women in his life in English boarding schools. What is it about it? And I think if we draw a long bow, and we've got a bit more work to do on this, we could see her as part of this romantic thing too. The innocence of the young girl in the remote landscape versus, you know, like Branza herself was a poet who was very, not very friendly, friends with in Ireland, who would have been, she was a poetess who wrote political poems. Catherine wouldn't have been anywhere in that category. So we've got a little bit more work to do to finish off that bow, but it's quite interesting because Catherine is soundly put down by all his friends. As, you know, why would he have married her? Okay, this association with the gentleman class. He's really, as we've said, I've said already, that he is building an Irish gentleman's demesne, affirming his place as a prosperous member of his class. And that's separation again. He associates only with the wealthy landowners and the other political exiles, and he avoids all other classes. He is saying, I am a gentleman regardless of what you do to me as a political prisoner. And that's confirmed, well, supported by Lyons, who knew him and wrote a biography of him in 1886. Meagher was a gentleman, an Irish gentleman. No flattery could add to the consciousness with which he already possessed, that he represented and was always ready to represent that class the world over. Sensitive, as he always was, to everything touching in the most delicate fashion his honour and his name. Just to tidy him up, because I know you want to know what happened to him. This long story in America, but he ended up as a brigadier general in the American Civil War, and there he is seated with some of his Union soldiers. And after the war, he got the position of territorial governor of Montana, where he died in mysterious circumstances off a paddle boat on the Missouri River, never to be found again. Body, no witnesses. And there's I don't know how many theories on what could happen to Meagher that night on the boat. Most of you are foresters, but we think this is all terribly long time ago, but if we transpose, we do a close-up of the tree in that sketch we're lucky to have, and we look at this tree today, he might have had the jetty out of perspective, but that tree is pretty close. It's got to be the same tree, it's just fallen over now. And so it isn't as long ago as we think. This coop has been subsequently harvested by SFM. My guns gave up on it. And they were very cooperative with the landowner, and a large reserve was put around it, and the trees, the basal rate increased or decreased. I can never get that one right. There's more trees than you might normally do in a partial harvest, so that the view looks very natural from out on the lake. The site has since been registered on Tasmanian Heritage Register, and so it added protection from that, but it's certainly not in any danger from harvesting. Okay, run out of time. Dianne and I have really enjoyed working together. You don't often get such close collaboration. You'd think we would be constantly working with history. But historians, Or archaeologists. But we have sort of, little walls that go between us, where the archaeologists go and do bad history, and the historians write history without an understanding of the physical world and the artefacts that the people were living in. So we've found the collaboration extremely useful by combining those skills of the physical evidence with the expert knowledge of the documents. And in doing so, and this is not final work yet, we believe we've constructed, and it is a construction, a much better understanding of our Mr. Meagher in Van Diemen's land, certainly than either of us could have ever done alone. And I think the approaches that we're now developing and following along from are quite innovative and will be interesting to both our professions. So thank you very much for listening to us this afternoon.